There are hundreds of features on this camera, but the 10 that you really use the most generally deal with metering, or not metering, but exposure and focusing. And so most of these have to deal with adjusting your shutter speeds, apertures, ISOs, and so forth. There's a number of focusing ones that are quite important, and I think the drive and white balance are pretty important as well. And so let's go through a couple of different options on how I would recommend setting up the camera. Now this is the super simple mode. You just want to leave it, you're not too particular about anything, just have it in a very, very simple mode. I would go with the program mode so that you can dive into any of the menus that you want. The camera will figure out shutter speeds and apertures, and if you leave it in auto, it's going to do an amazing job picking a reasonable shutter speed and reasonable aperture in any particular situation. Remember, you can use the program shift if you would temporarily like to get to a different combination. Next up, make sure your exposure compensation is set at 0 unless you specifically want it brighter or darker than average, and you'll have to probably take a look at the results from your first test photos to know that. The metering, I am totally fine with Evaluative. It does a very good job, and it's probably the safest place. It is the safest place to leave your metering system. For white balance, auto does a pretty good job. You will adjust that as necessary in different light conditions. For general photography, one-shot focus is where the camera will focus and stop focusing on a subject so that you can recompose. For focus area, I don't like all points a lot, but it's very simple and it's easy to just point the camera in the general direction that you want to take a picture, and it generally does a pretty good job. Remember that when it looks at all the points, it's choosing whatever is closest to the camera, and so that may not work in all situations. And for the drive mode, I would normally just leave it in the single shot mode. So having said that, let's jump to some different types of photography. Let's do some old school or retro photography. So you're going to shoot film like you did back in the manual days. Full manual on the exposure. You're going to set whatever shutter speed. You can set 2/50th just for fun. Set an aperture like f8, because there's a great old saying in photography, f8 and be there is how you take great shots. For ISO, maybe you want to mimic the Tri-X 400 speeds that you shot in the yesteryears. So you could set that at 400. And on traditional cameras, they had center weighted meters. And so if you want to mimic that, you could put your camera in center weighted meter. White balance, let's just leave that in auto and be simple. And for manual focus, now remember when you switch manual focus, I'll go over to my camera here, the switch for that is always on the lens on Canon cameras. And so if you switch it in manual, that's where you have to switch it back to get into the automatic mode. And then in the drive mode, I would probably just leave it in the continuous mode so that you can shoot pictures on a sequential basis.